Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first on the hazardous weather graphic, winter storm warning continues for the eastern interior there north of the Alaska Range until, 4 p.m. Thursday, and that's for 7 to 12 inches of snow to fall from now until 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And that's heaviest amounts will be south of Chicken and west of Dot Lake. And again, that's out through 4 p.m. Thursday. And then another winter storm warning for heavy snow over the Copper River Basin. And that's until 10 a.m. Thursday for 8 to 14 inches of snow. And snow already well underway into the Copper River Basin this afternoon, with several inches falling in the Glen Allen Gulkana area. And again, looking for a total of up to 8 to 14 inches there. And the flood watch continues, through late Friday night for the eastern North Gulf Coast and the northern Panhandle due to increasing rain coming in now and overnight tonight into tomorrow, which could result in flooding of rivers. And then up to the north, western central Arctic coast, coastal flood warnings and high surf advisories, or coastal flood advisory and high surf advisories continue until, 4 p.m. Thursday for the central and western Arctic coast for some minor beach erosion in that area there. Now onto satellite imagery. You can see a band of moisture kind of moving eastward along into the eastern Arctic coast and then southeastward into the DeLong Mountains there and the western Brooks Range area, bringing some snow to that area. And then all the moisture streaming northward from southern Alaska and kind of shifting off to the east-northeast there over the Kenai Peninsula, just grazing the Anchorage area with some light snow up into the Matanuska Valley mostly, and then rain, Valdez over into Cordova and into the northern Panhandle areas. And then another front out to the west there, spreading wind and rain into the central Aleutians, beginning to push in toward the eastern Aleutians later tonight, and also up to the Pribilofs with some gale force winds in those areas. The main low center back out toward the Komodorskis today. The front, though, has the tighter gradient ahead of it, and that bringing the wind and rain into the central Aleutians. And then that low approaching the Gulf of Alaska edged some rain into the east side, Kodiak State Airport there, and also some very light snow into Anchorage earlier, flurries up toward Birchwood and maybe in toward Eagle River, but most of that staying off to the east. Couple inches of snow falling in Portage and an inch or two falling at Alyeska by early afternoon today. And again, mostly a rain situation over Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast areas there, with the rain on the increase around Yakutat, and rain starting to increase about 1/4 of an inch falling in Juneau today. Otherwise, snow up along the western Arctic coast there, heaviest, and then lighter onto the east, with winds pretty gusty up there, anywhere from 30 to 45 miles an hour along the entire stretch of the Arctic coast and locally into the North Slope. Otherwise, a lot of clearing and chilly temperatures west of the Alaska Range into the Kuskokwim Valley and Seward Peninsula area. High pressure making for light winds over the northern and eastern Bering Sea and Alaska Peninsula. For tonight, gale force winds moving to the eastern Aleutians and Pribilof Islands. Otherwise, snow ending from west to east, but heavy at times over the Copper River Basin into the 40-mile country area, with rain starting to diminish late tonight for the eastern North Gulf Coast as it increases. Both wind and rain increases over the central and northern Panhandle. Southern areas, though, could stay dry down toward Dixon Entrance, and still periods of snow for the western central Arctic coast, flurries on the east side. And for Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula, gale force winds And rain, moderate to possibly heavy at times, and wind and rain for the Pribilofs, wind and rain for the western Aleutians, lighter winds with fog, rain, and drizzle for AKwx in toward Nikolsky, and snow slowly ending from west to east over the eastern interior there in Copper River Basin, probably lasting through the day, though, but it'll become lighter into the afternoon. Still periods of snow and diminishing winds, though, for the Arctic coast and North Slope. And rain, moderate to heavy at times, especially early on over the northern panhandle, with light rain all the way down into the southern areas. And then for Friday, still another warm front, keeping chance of rain, fog, and drizzle over the southern panhandle, otherwise drying out to the north. And gusty east winds across the Gulf of Alaska into Cook Inlet out of the northeast. And chilly conditions as well over the interior, mostly clear skies, but dry conditions over much of interior Alaska. Just some isolated snow showers, a few flurries along the Arctic coast with much lighter winds. Wind and rain for the Pribilofs and Alaska Peninsula. Lows tonight in the 50s, upper 50s, some areas of the Panhandle. Otherwise, lows in the 20s over interior Alaska to mid-30s Kodiak Island. Highs 30s to mid-40s over the coastal areas of Alaska there, and 55 to 60 for the Panhandle, followed by lows chillier, 42, or mostly in the 40s for the Panhandle. Falling below zero, Copper River Basin, -2 at Gulkana, into the teens in the Susitna Valley, otherwise 20s. And highs, 20s and 30s, 50s to lower 60s for the Panhandle. Up to the north, lows either side of zero in the Brooks Range, otherwise teens and 20s. Followed by highs in the 20s to lower 30s, mid-30s out toward the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island area, and lows near zero in the Brooks Range, teens and 20s to the Arctic coast, lower to mid-teens in the interior, some single numbers showing up now over the eastern interior, followed by highs in the...
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Flying weather showing marginal VFR up over the North Slope and much of the Arctic coast, extending down across Noatak Valley, Kotzebue, Selawik, and then eastward and across the Kobuk and part of the Koyukuk Valley close to the Yukon River. And then an IFR zone there, mostly north of the Aleutians, but pushing in across the Fox Islands. Marginal VFR for the Pribilofs. Good VFR, Susitna, Manduska Valley, Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound, Kodiak, Bristol Bay, and all the southwest coast, northern Bering Sea. IFR over the eastern interior, down to the eastern North Gulf Coast, covering the Panhandle. And for the afternoon, things improve considerably on the east side there. Just some leftover areas of marginal VFR over the mountainous terrain, Wrangell Mountains, maybe the far eastern Alaska Range. IFR southern Panhandle marginal to the north, so improving there, especially over the northern areas. North Gulf Coast VFR. Some marginal VFR over the northwest interior, up to the North Slope and Arctic coast. Otherwise, mainland Alaska, pretty much VFR, including Kodiak Island. IFR from the Alaska Peninsula to Kiska Island and northward across St. George and St. Paul Islands. And for Friday morning, back to marginal VFR over the northwest part of the state, all the way out to the North Slope and Arctic coast, staying VFR though over toward Kaktovik and Barter Island. And maybe some IFR to start over the Yukon Flats. That'd be low clouds, fog type of IFR. And some marginal VFR, Eastern Alaska Range, Northway Tok up to close to Eagle, but nothing too significant there. IFR back in over the Panhandle, marginal VFR into Yakutat. IFR Atka Island eastward to the Alaska Peninsula and north across the Pribilofs. And then for the afternoon, lose the IFR out over the Bering Sea, but marginal VFR from St. Matthew Island southward and eastward across Cape Newenham, Togiak, Dillingham, all of Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula staying VFR. In fact, mainland Alaska VFR all the way up to the Brooks Range. And then you got marginal VFR for the North Slope, some IFR in the central Arctic coast, marginal VFR southern 2/3 of the Panhandle. And for passes, Anatuvik starting out marginal, becoming VFR though throughout the late morning hours into the afternoon. Adigan, VFR start to finish. Lake Clark and Merrill looking good with VFR flying in the western Alaska Range. Even rainy VFR, windy as well. VFR, Isabel starting out lower and then becoming VFR at some point in the day, maybe before noon. And from Mentasta, Upward trending conditions there started out IFR, becoming VFR into the latter part of the afternoon. Tanita, VFR. Chilcoot, or Portage, almost skipped it, VFR. And now Chilcoot and White, IFR, becoming marginal, some improvement throughout the day there as well. And for the freezing levels, 2,000 feet over the southeastern Copper River Basin, and then 8 to 10,000 feet over the Panhandle. Out west, 4,000 feet there over the Aleutians, 2,000 feet cutting across Unalaska Island, and then up along the Barren Islands to about Cordova. Icing could be some considerable moderate rime icing, northern Panhandle, give or take, otherwise just isolated moderate, mostly east of Yakutat all the way down to the Queen Charlottes. And then with the front coming eastward there, some considerable moderate rime icing eastern Aleutians earlier, and then moving into the Alaska Peninsula later in the day. And for the jet stream, southwest flow about 80 to 105 knots into the southeast coast, westerly 65 to 85 knots across southern Alaska, southwest 90 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And at 9,000 feet, that upper level low center there, just east-northeast of Atka Island, so there's southeast winds about 45 knots across the Alaska Peninsula, Unalaska Island into the Pribilofs, coming back around from the north-northeast, 40 knots for the western Aleutians, and then winds coming down, still pretty strong there over the northern eastern part of the southeast coast, but about 45 knots, and some westerlies continuing for the north slope and Arctic coast of about 35 knots. And for 3,000 feet, much lighter winds on the Arctic coast and north slope up there. Still a little breezy on the east side. 35 knot winds, southern Panhandle, lighter to the north. Light variable winds under high pressure interior Alaska into the Gulf. 60 knots ahead of that front coming in to the western Alaska Peninsula right across the Pribilofs. Turbulence, moderate chop, Alaska Peninsula, southern Panhandle, Pribilofs, and the western Aleutians.
When I first started working here in the early 90s, this is where the glacier was. I mean, where we're walking right now would have been a pile of gravel that had been pushed up by the glacier, and then we would have had 100 to 200 foot high cliffs of ice right here. And as you can see, that's changed quite a bit. And if you look at that in 2 dimensions, you can sort of see the terminus used to be here, now it's back there. That gives you one measure. What that kind of 2-dimensional look doesn't show is how much mass has been lost, that the glacier has just sort of deflated. These 200-foot cliffs of ice have disappeared and pulled back to this gentle sloping glacier you see now.
When I was working in Kenai Fjords National Park, I used the topographic maps to navigate where I was, and I realized that the mapping of the glaciers was really off. The glaciers had receded a lot. There were new rivers and lakes that were establishing where the ice used to be or should have been according to the maps. And so then I did a study on this and found out that we had a 5% loss of glacier ice mass in the Kenai Fjords area between 1950 and 1985. Big change.
You know, one of the most compelling things we do, though, to document glacier change is simply take photographs. We've had repeat photography projects here at the park. They may not give you the most accurate data in terms of how much mass or real specific measurements, but what they do give you is a visual representation that can't be argued with. I mean, it really requires no interpretation.
Understanding what's happening, understanding these processes, and possibly being able to predict what's going to happen in the future is the best that we can do, and that requires science and research.
There's considerable research on climate change in Alaska. The most significant, I would say right now, is the Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring Program, which is looking at change across a wide variety of vital signs or indicators.
Kenai Fjords National Park is actually a pretty good representation of what's going on globally with regards to glacier ice retreat. There have been studies showing that mountain glaciers are retreating all over the planet. There Probably well over 90% of the glaciers are in retreat status. There are a few that are advancing, and some are holding, their terminus point. But the Kenai fjords, the tidewater glaciers are retreating more dramatically, but even the land-based glaciers in the terminus positions are retreating. It's pretty common for all the mountain glaciers. The big mountain glaciers in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, they're mostly in retreat too. We're really entering an interesting phase where what we call the cryosphere, the ice on the planet, is melting.
You know, in the more immediate past, it's clear that since the Pleistocene, glaciers have been retreating. So the idea that glaciers retreat is is no revelation. They've been retreating from across North America for the last 10,000 years. What appears to have changed and what has people's attention is the rate at which they're retreating. In the case of Exit Glacier, we have scientists who've been looking at it. We have evidence that the glaciers left behind, where we can track that retreat for about the last 200 years. And we can say with confidence that in the last decade, that rate has increased.
Terminus mapping is a great way to map a small portion of the ice field. We come out twice a year and we use a GPS to walk the edge of the terminus and map the farthest extent of Exit Glacier. And that allows us to see what type of changes are occurring over the winter accumulation period and the summer ablation period. With that data, that can help us as we witness these changes within the ice field, we can hopefully be able to correlate that with the weather data that we have.
When you look at an ice field that's 750 square miles, when you look at a glacier that towers hundreds of feet high, you get a sense of permanence. You think these things are massive, they're somehow a permanent sort of feature, and yet in a very short period of time, in a matter of a couple of decades, we've seen dramatic change in those things.
At Exit Glacier, we have a time-lapse camera set up on the glacier that allows us to take a couple photos every single day, and then to put that sequence of photos into a video where we can see changes of the glacier and the vegetation phenology throughout an entire year.
Virtually all the glaciers in Alaska are receding. Some glaciers are moving forward. That's not an indication that they're actually growing in size. It's just the rate at which they're slipping down the mountain.
In some cases, some of these glaciers are receding back up onto land, and so they're producing less ice. When you change the glacier systems, you're changing habitat for marine mammals and other wildlife. And the populations of harbor seals have dropped dramatically in the fjords. In 1980, shortly after the establishment of the park, in Island Bay, we had maybe 1,500 harbor seals. Nowadays, it's a few hundred.
In Arctic environments, much of the sunlight that reaches the Earth bounces back because it hits snow and reflects off into space, or ice on the ocean and reflects off into space. That's the albedo effect. When the snow thaws and instead you have rock or vegetation, or when the ice thaws and you have transparent ocean, the sunlight will convert to other wavelengths that'll convert essentially to warmth. That does not bounce back into the atmosphere as much. So consequently, you get a warming of the ocean, you get a warming of the ground, you get a thawing of frozen soils or permafrost, you get a more rapid thawing of sea ice. So once the ice and once the snow is off of the surface, the rate of warming increases considerably.
If you're driving out to Exit Glacier, you'll actually start to see signs along the side of the road that have dates on them. Visitors sometimes are confused. They think they're elevations or something until they get up to the glacier and realize, oh, those were all date signs along the road that were telling me when the glacier was there. Another thing that's been happening in the Exit Glacier area in recent years is this flooding that comes at a time we're not used to. We're used to having maybe some flooding in the fall when we have a lot of heavy rain. This has suddenly been some flooding that's coming in the middle of the summer, usually not associated with precipitation events. It's associated with warmer weather and melting. When you walk down one of our trails that leads to Exit Glacier, there are a number of ways to get out there, but what used to be the main route is no longer really the main route because of the way the glacier has changed. So this main route to the glacier used to provide dramatic views of the glacier as you walk towards it. In fact, there was a large kiosk built at the end of this trail for people to stop and rest and enjoy the view of the glacier. Now, if they stop and rest at this kiosk, people think, why did the park put a kiosk here? Because it looks out at some shrubs. And there's no glacier within view anymore.
The way we solve big problems like this is not all at once. There's a thing called the Sokolov's wedges, and you just take a little bite of the pie, one sliver at a time. So we try to do incremental changes.
When we talk to people about our concerns about climate change, about the changes that are happening to the glacier, we also want to leave them with some idea of what we're doing to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. For example, here at the park, as we retire vehicles out of our fleet, we try to replace them with electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We've done things like at the Exit Glacier Nature Center, helping to sort of experiment and install a cutting-edge fuel cell as opposed to running some traditional power source out there that relies on some sort of more greenhouse-producing gas.
My main hope for the future is that people get the message that the planet is changing fairly rapidly in places, particularly places like Kenai Fjords National Park, and that it is, we think, there's good evidence it's a result of atmospheric changes, which are measured in terms of human inputs into the atmosphere.
The rapid rate at which these glaciers are changing now offers us the opportunity to talk about this place as a way of looking into the future. In a lot of parts of the country, climate change issues are a little more subtle, and we can point here and say, look how fast this is changing. This is what the future holds for perhaps a lot of us and a lot of the planet as climate continues to change.
I'm optimistic that people and nature will adapt to change, but my expectation is that change will occur. Time will tell.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And for the coastal water forecast, gales along the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow. South winds 35 knots and south 40 knots on the central north coast. And then up farther to the north, winds will be west at 20 knots. Look for gale warnings over Stevens Passage and through Lynn Canal. South to southeast winds there up to 35 knots with a few higher gusts. Clarence Strait, small craft advisories. Southeast winds 30 knots, seas 8 feet. And for the day Friday, small craft advisories along the coast. On the south coast, southerly winds 25 to 30 knots. East-southeast winds 30 knots for the north coast, seas running 8 to 12 feet. And for Lynn Canal, northwest winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Stevens Passage, southeast winds 20 knots. Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Prince William Sound for Thursday, northwest winds at 30 knots. West-northwest winds 30 knots for the North Gulf Coast, seas 12 feet. Barren Islands, winds will be out of the northwest at 30 knots. Have some gale warnings for Kamishak Bay on Thursday for westerlies at 35 knots. Cook Inlet, north winds 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas. And for Friday, for Cook Inlet, northern Cook Inlet, small craft advisories. North winds 25 knots, seas 6 feet. Northeast winds 35 knots with 10-foot seas for southern Cook Inlet. Gale warnings also for Kamishak Bay. Northeast at 40 knots and southeast winds 40 knots for the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, east winds 30 knots, 30 to 40 knots. Gale warnings on the western North Gulf Coast. Seas 12 to 14 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast winds at 20 knots with 3-foot seas. And for Kodiak Island for Thursday, west-northwest winds at about 20 knots, seas 4 to 9 feet. And gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And Bristol Bay, southeast winds 20 knots. For Friday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula and the east side and Kodiak Island. Mostly east winds, 35 knots. Northeast 40-knot winds in Shelikof Strait. Bristol Bay, northeast winds at 30 knots. And for Unalaska Island on Thursday, southeast winds, 40 knots, seas 12 to 16 feet, Unimak Island, on average, a south wind of 20 to 30 knots, and west winds 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians. Western Aleutians, west-northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And for Friday, gale warnings for the from Mamchitka Island to Atka, northwest winds 35 to 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, northeast to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, seas 11 to 13 feet. And for the Pribilofs, gale warnings for Thursday, east winds 40 knots. And the southwest coast, small craft advisories, east winds 25 knots. Northeast at 30 for St. Matthew Island, northeast 15 for St. Lawrence Island. And for Friday, east winds 20 knots, St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, northeast winds 35 knots. Gale warnings also for the Pribilofs, northeast winds 40 knots. North winds at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, east winds at 20 knots. For tonight, central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Western Arctic coast, northwest winds at 20 knots, and from Cape Thompson to Wales, northwest at 15. And for Friday, Wales to Cape Beaufort, south to southwest winds 10 to 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Western and central Arctic coast, winds will be west at 20 knots. Small craft advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for west winds at 25 knots with 5 to 7-foot seas. And for tonight, winter storm warning continues for the eastern interior, 40-mile country, and the Copper River Basin for heavy snow, anywhere from 8 to 14 inches through tonight and into early tomorrow. And the flood watch continues for the eastern North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle for possible flooding due to the incoming heavy rains, and the coastal flood advisory and watch, or coastal flood advisory and coastal flood watch advisory also for the central and western Arctic coast through 4 p.m. Friday. And for the look for gale force winds and rain into the eastern Aleutians and Pribilofs. That front will push to the Alaska Peninsula and keep it wet and windy over the Pribilofs and much of the Aleutians. Rain starts to diminish over the Panhandle. Snow slowly ends from west to east over the eastern interior. Dry and chilly over interior Alaska on Friday. Increasing rain once again, light rain late in the day over the southern Panhandle. Becoming windy along the North Gulf Coast and Kodiak Island.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.